I remember flicking on the TV on December 2nd, 2016, and watching with fascination the sea of humanity, clothed in white, converging onto the Istiqlal Mosque in Jakarta, the hundreds of thousands who overflowed into the more secular national monument, Monas, the symbol of the Unitary Republic. There had never been anything like it, not even during the War of Independence, not during the Reformasi protests that brought down Suharto. No crowd came close to that size, 500,000 by some counts, nor when she elected the first president to come from outside the military or the religious or political elite that supplied the previous 6 presidents who came before. The prayer rally, now known by its date 212, roused President Joko Widodo from the presidential palace across the road and into a torrential downpour to walk among those assembled and telegraph that he was listening. The catalyst of the crowd's ire were recorded comments by the then governor of Jakarta, Basuki Tjahaja Purnama, better known as Ahok. Those comments made it sound as if he was saying the Quran was a lie. He didn't say that at all, but that wasn't the point. The Christian governor of ethnic Chinese descent was governing a province of 10 million that was more than 80% Muslim, and that wasn't going to fly. Tian, my husband, and I went down there. Tian was helping me translate because my Indonesian wasn't up to it at the time. I'm protecting my religion. This isn't racism, I was told again and again, while packages of dates were pressed into my hand and bottles of water and Bukhari sweat were too. I posed for photos with the protesters. It didn't feel like a protest. It was a lot more orderly than that, and frankly, a lot more powerful. This was a statement in boldface, and it was saying Jakarta, if not Indonesia, is Muslim, and don't forget it. Up until then, I was among the reporters who were writing about how advanced and tolerant Indonesia was becoming. It had an ethnic Chinese Christian as governor of Jakarta. It was surely a testament to Indonesia's evolution as a democracy. And these guys were like William F. Buckley, standing athwart history, yelling, "Stop." On the basis of this surge in conservative religiosity is the topic of my next guest. Krithika Varagur is an independent journalist whose publications include The Atlantic and the New York Review of Books. Her new book, The Call, Inside the Global Saudi Religious Project, goes some way to explain how it was on that Friday during the rainy season I stood on Jalan Sudirman as drenched believers eddied and flowed around me. The book explains how Saudi Arabia funded and supported the spread of its conservative brand of Islam throughout the Muslim world. Krithika joined me via Zoom from her home in Oregon, and I began by asking her what prompted her to write the book. Krithika, thanks so much for joining me.
Great to be here.
I just wanted to ask you first, what drew you to write the book?
So I moved to Jakarta in October 2016, and I was really interested in writing about religion and politics, but I didn't have a really set agenda. And of course, as you know, as much as me, right after I moved there, the Ahok blasphemy demos and trial and the whole saga started right after that. So I really, it was really a dramatic theater for Islamism and religious conservatism and so on. And because of that, I started looking into the Islamic Defenders Front, or FPI. And one of the first public figures I ever saw in real life, just a couple weeks after I moved to Jakarta, was Habib Rizik Shihab. And I was looking into his background, and I learned about the fact that he studied at the Saudi University in Jakarta and had spent a lot of time actually in Saudi Arabia too. And as I did some more research as the weeks and months went on into the so-called conservative turn in Indonesia that was driving a lot of the news that I was writing about, I kept hearing this word Arabisasi in Bahasa Indonesia, which was this idea that Arab influence and specifically Saudi money had really changed Indonesia in the years up until when I moved there. I was really interested in this for obvious reasons. It was very intriguing. Like, how could a country in the Gulf transform the world's largest Muslim majority country that's so far away geographically? So I started reporting on it. It seemed to get at a lot of different things, from the Ahok campaign to, different the rise of the Prosperous Justice Party and a lot of different things. So I started reporting on what the Saudi campaign actually did in Indonesia. And I was really interested when I found that it was more complex than the word Arabisasi would suggest. There were a lot of different outlets of Saudi proselytization. This university in Jakarta called Lipia is really unique. There's really nothing like it in the world. It's a Saudi university right in the middle of South Jakarta. And the Saudi-Indonesian relationship went back to the very beginning of the very earliest years of the Indonesian Republic. And it was forged very actively, not just by Saudi dark money, but by one of Indonesia's founding fathers, Muhammad Natsir, who was the first prime minister of the country. So when I learned about all this rich history and started reporting on it in detail, it hadn't really been told cohesively in that way before. So I kept working on it, and it was really interesting. And eventually, because what had happened in Indonesia was not an isolated case, and in fact, Saudi had done similar things around the greater Muslim world, I decided to write a book, bringing in a few different other places too.
What I loved about the book is that you took something that was just considered a truism, just sort of this catch-all blanket phrase of the Arabization of Indonesian Islam, and you really connected the dots. But I suppose we need to, what I was hoping you might help me understand is really what it is we're talking about here, Wahhabism. What is the difference between the Saudi variant of Islam and what was the Indonesian variant of Islam? Well, it still exists in pockets, but how would you define that difference?
That's a great question. Wahhabism, really briefly, is the state religion of Saudi Arabia. It is a very conservative, literalist, text-based approach to Sunni Islam that started in the 18th century. And it's named after this preacher named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was a pretty charismatic, but also very austere and violent preacher who was very much against Sufi practices and idolatry, and a lot of kind of folk Islams that he saw in the Arabian Peninsula. And back in the 18th century, he signed a pact with the House of Saud, the Saudi royal family, whereby he would give religious legitimacy to their rule, and in turn they would protect him and adopt his kind of Islam as their religion. So that pact has kind of held since then, and it continues to hold today because the House of Saud is once again in power, and they consolidated the country of Saudi Arabia in 1932. So Wahhabism is basically it's very site specific to Saudi Arabia, and it only really makes sense in that context. In Indonesia, I tend to say there are Indonesian Islams and not one Islam. There are many different kinds of folk expression of Islam in the archipelago. No one is exactly sure how it got there. There's not a huge textual record of history in Indonesia. It seems likely that Islam got to these islands around the 13th century, maybe a little bit later, through Arab merchants and traders. And there's also a big Yemeni Hadrami diaspora here as well. And it tended to be Sunni orientation as well, but it also was deeply intertwined with folk practices in different islands. In Java, it mixed a lot with this animist indigenous tradition called Kejawen, which has some elective affinities with Hindu and Buddhist ritual, a lot of fire rituals and things like that. In Aceh, there's a lot of practices that other Muslims would consider Shia, like celebrating Muharram, the mourning month, but they wouldn't really use those labels. So basically, there were a lot of different kinds of Islam, and it was very pluralistic for a long time because it was not strictly regulated during Dutch colonial rule. They cared about a lot of things, but they didn't care about codifying the kind of Islam in Indonesia. So what is meant by Indonesian Islam became an issue only in the 20th century when certain groups started to come together, like NU, which remains the biggest Muslim organization in the country today. And they tried to figure out what they did mean by Indonesian Islam, because they were concerned about these currents from the Arab world that were making themselves known in Indonesia. But it's never really been one thing. It has been somewhat more pluralistic and tolerant of folk practices than Wahhabism, for sure. And it's been somewhat more progressive on some fronts, but it's not a hard and fast rule. So I would say that it would be hard to define it as one thing, whereas Wahhabism has very much always been about defining a very clear set of beliefs.
Right. And you were mentioning in your opening, just at the outset of the interview, that the Saudi variant, the Wahhabist variant of Islam got its purchase in Indonesia through the help with Muhammad Natsir. And he was instrumental in setting up the Indonesia Islamic Dawah Council. Can you tell us about that and its connection with the House of Fahd?
Yeah, so Muhammad Natsir, he was from Sumatra. He was a very pious Islamic scholar, and he was one of the founding fathers of Indonesia. But his vision for what Indonesia should be like as a post-colonial country was really different from that of Sukarno, who was the first president. He wanted Indonesia to be more like specifically Muslim in character, and he clashed a lot with the secular designs of the Sukarno government. So he was pushed out, and he actually was forced to go into exile in the Sumatran jungle. And, after that, his political career was over. But he didn't give up his project because of that. He just said famously, before we used politics to do our preaching, now we'll use preaching as a means of politics. So what he meant was that he would turn his attention to just straight, unmediated religious activity instead of trying to use politics to bring about Islamic awareness. And he developed a close relationship with the Saudi king at the time, King Faisal, who was the first globally minded Saudi monarch as well. So this was all happening in the 50s and 60s after World War II, after this huge number of newly post-colonial nations were kind of created out of thin air almost overnight. And he was really interested in staking a place for Saudi Arabia as the leader of the Muslim world in this tumultuous time period. So he saw Muhammad Natsir, he met him in Saudi Arabia many times. He saw him as this kind of pious emissary from Southeast Asia, from this new country full of Muslims, full of the most Muslims in the world, famously. And he basically opened the taps of funding to him. So Natsir set up this organization called Dewan Dakwah Islamiyah Indonesia, or DDII, which became the conduit for millions of dollars from a bunch of different Saudi charities, including the Muslim World League, starting in the 1960s. And DDII actually still exists today, but they don't get direct funding from Saudi anymore, which is really interesting. But in their heyday, DDII basically just funded a whole manner of things, including scholarships for Indonesian students to study in Saudi Arabia. It supported mosques. It had preachers on its payroll. They helped translate a lot of Islamist books and Wahhabi books into Bahasa Indonesia, and so on.
When you think about it, though, Natsir must have been quite the salesman, because really on the face of it, he very, very much was on the outs. He was, as you say, in hiding, and he was a has-been. How did he manage to sell himself as the guy to sell Wahhabism to Indonesia?
I think, first of all, he would not have pitched it as selling Wahhabism. They would have just considered it dawah, or proselytization to Islam.
Dawah, right.
Yeah. So, one thing about the Saudi project is, although Saudi Arabia is very much a Wahhabi state, some of the expressions of Saudi dawah had been less controlled and less on message than they'd have liked. So he basically, Muhammad Natsir's biggest concern at the time that he founded it was Christian missionary activity. And he was really concerned that Indonesians were converting to Christianity.
Right.
So his basic thrust was get them into Islam, not let's get them into Wahhabism. So I don't think the lines were quite so sharp when he first started. And I also think he was pretty upfront about who he was and what he was doing. And I think, I'm speculating a little bit here, but I think the fact that he wasn't a politician might have even been attractive to the Saudi king, because one of the main tenets of Wahhabism is to keep religion and politics separate. And Wahhabism is very much based on obedience to the political rulers at the time. So in Saudi Arabia, that means the Saudi royal family. But I don't think his being outside of politics would have been a demerit in their eyes. They might have even seen it as an extra pious credential.
So am I right in thinking that it's Nasir and King Faisal were the ones who really brought the two countries together in this regard? Because you said that they were kind of at an arm's length with each other. It wasn't very cozy until the late 60s. So these are the guys that made the link?
Yeah, there was kind of a weird diplomatic incident in the early 1960s where the Indonesian authorities did a raid into the Saudi ambassador's residence in Bogor, and they abruptly recalled the ambassador, and it was kind of this awkward tension. So Natsir did rekindle this relationship on the kind of grassroots level, on a kind of just different level outside diplomatic channels. And that in turn connected the countries in the diplomatic channel as well. But it started with the religious outreach, and then that helped them come together again on the diplomatic side.
So tell us about the Islamic Arabic College of Indonesia, or LIPIA.
Yeah, Libya is so interesting. To me, it's one of the most interesting outposts of the Saudi campaign in the world. It's a brick and mortar university right in South Jakarta, near, oh my God, it's near one of the malls, but you can tell I haven't lived there in a few months because I forget which mall. Pejaten Village, it's right near that mall. And it was built in 1980, and the year is important because it was built 1 year after the Iranian Revolution. This is a branch of a university in Riyadh, and it was the first foreign educational institution ever built in Indonesia, and it was built by royal decree from Saudi Arabia. It's still basically overseen by the Saudi embassy. Its leader and administrative staff are Saudi nationals, although the teachers and faculty come from many different countries. And the language of instruction is entirely in Arabic. So this is such an interesting university, and they really built it to drive us, to plant a flag in the ground after the Iranian Revolution, because this revolution was such a huge event in the Muslim world. It was the biggest victory ever of Islamism as a political ideology, and where this cleric had managed to overthrow these Western affiliated, seemingly decadent royals. And it sent shockwaves throughout the Muslim world, and it really affects Indonesians. A lot of intellectuals and clerics converted to Shiism inspired by the Iranian Revolution. People translated books by like Ali Shariati and Khomeini into Bahasa Indonesia, and people were flying to Tehran and things like this. This was all terrifying to Saudi, and this was going on all around the world. So they were like, if there's a kind of domino effect where the Iranian Revolution, which is Shia and anti-royalist, which is both threatening to Saudi, spreads to more countries, we're going to have a big problem on our hands. We're not going to be the leader of the Islamic world anymore. So it's no coincidence that in 1980, they stepped up all of their investments. And I think Libya is a really good example of that. And it has graduated some of the most influential religious and political figures that have shaped Indonesia today. I mentioned Habib Rizik Shihab earlier. He, of course, founded the FPI, very influential guerrilla group turned kind of quasi-political actor in recent years. It graduated Hidayat Nur Wahid, who was the president of the Prosperous Justice Party, or PKS, the most successful Islamist party ever in Indonesian history, directly inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of affiliates of Jamaat Islamiyah and JAD, two major jihadist groups in Indonesia, have also passed through there. And there was a lot of interchange between Libya and the Nuruki school in central Java, which became infamous as a hotbed of jihadi activity. So all of these institutions were pretty closely linked throughout the 80s and 90s.
I'm speaking with journalist Krithika Varagur. She's the author of The Call, Inside the Global Saudi Religious Project. You were talking about sort of the through line of the infamous types that have passed through this school. What is the status of Libya now?
So Libya has been Indonesianized, in a word. It's still completely in Arabic. It's still overseen by the Saudi embassy, but I visited 3 times, and it's changed a lot just in the times I've visited. So the Indonesian Education Ministry has vetted its curriculum. And they have to teach concepts like Pancasila, which is the political philosophy of Indonesia now. They also have brought on a fair number of women teachers and professors, because they do maintain gender segregation at this university. And before this, and still to some extent today, girls' classrooms are one floor above the boys' classrooms, and they watch the live stream lecture from a floor below. But they're trying to bring in more female professors to change this. And they even started a futsal league, and they play with non-religious universities. And, perhaps most interesting, in my last visit in 2019, it was draped in Vision 2030 banners, which is, of course, the signature economic modernization program of Mohammed bin Salman. So that was really interesting to me because it shows how Vision 2030 colors Saudi diplomacy and soft power, too. I believe they still teach Wahhabi theology, and theology is a required subject at this university. So I don't know if it's a matter of just skin deep changes. But to me, given how influential Libya has been and how unique it is in the world, these changes are pretty interesting and significant, even if they are at the surface level as of now.
Well, it would be sort of a target after the events of 9/11 and the terror attacks at the beginning of the 2000s. But what was the impact of those terrorist attacks on the Saudi project here?
It's so interesting. After 9/11, the Saudi project never recovered because it just became the PR damage to Saudi Arabia, which, of course, if you recall, 15 of the 19 Saudi 9/11 hijackers were Saudi nationals. And Saudi Arabia became kind of inextricably linked with this concept of terror finance. So there was this huge scrutiny on their financial outflows. And because of this, even their proselytization and dawah activities that were somewhat above ground took a big hit. So the money almost dried up in all the countries that I visited after 9/11 because they were very scared of this reputation that they were getting. And this wasn't just in the US. Al-Qaeda actually attacked targets within Saudi Arabia in 2003 and 2004.
Right.
So throughout the early 2000s, they were really terrified about their, at times inadvertent, at times explicit links to Salafi jihadism. So at DDII, for example, the money completely dried up after 9/11. Same thing in Nigeria. I met, the director of the Muslim World League there, who said the taps just closed after 9/11,
Yeah.
and now he's the only person still employed there. So that's a significant thing to talk about when we talk about Saudi money and something like Arabi Sasi. It's simply not as big now in material terms as it was in the 80s and 90s. That being said, it has a lot of legacy effects, which I go into in the book and which are pretty significant. But it's not like a cure-all answer or solution to all the social ills or conservative signs in Indonesia today, because it's simply not powerful enough for us to say that.
Well, it's going on nearly 20 years now since 9/11. Where are they getting the money? When we're talking about Saudi money, that's not actually true anymore. So what money are we talking about?
I think they still have money earmarked for the Dawah Ministry and the Muslim World League and things like that. There's still definitely money flowing through Saudi Arabia. It's true that the 2014 oil crisis was a big hit, and it seems like every year there's a new benchmark being set for how low oil prices can go. And of course, this year with the pandemic, it was truly shocking how low they could go. So I don't think they're going to return to the flush state of the late 20th century. There's still money going around, and who knows if their economic modernization goes well especially after the pandemic, and if they succeed in diversifying the economy, there could be money again going through these. It seems as of now, if MBS stays in power, this project is not going to be a priority. He seems to be somewhat conscious of the Saudi image as, terra financiers and so on. And officials in the Dawa ministry have said that he has cut off resources somewhat to their ministry since he came to power. So I predict that, whether or not the money or the GDP goes up or down, we're going to keep seeing this decelerationist trend.
Well, we're seeing so many occurrences buffeting this trend. There was the oil prices, as you say. Also, the growing influence of the military in the Joko Widodo administration. Have we seen peak Arabization, do you think? Is it in the rearview mirror?
I don't want to speak too soon. I think it's peak Arabization. I mean, I think that's fair to say. I think it's, the direct Saudi influence has peaked. That being said, I don't think we've seen peak Salafism in Indonesia. It really has its own momentum now, and I'm sure you know about the Hijrah movement, where like Indonesian millennials are in many cases becoming more conservative than their parents. Yes. There are tons of very popular Salafi ulama. They don't really need Saudi money to keep it going, though. I mean, every single fatwa of Bin Baz is on the internet now. You can read the Book of Tawheed online. There's so many resources, and the Salafi communities are really standing on their own feet. So yeah, I think we've seen peak Arabisasi. I don't think we've seen peak conservatism or Salafism or any of those things.
You were mentioning about the Jakarta election in 2017, and you were mentioning that was very much diving into the deep end for you. The re-election bid by Basuki Purnama, or better known as Ahok, he lost emphatically and was jailed for blasphemy. I'm curious about your views as someone who spent a good amount of time here and did some very deep research. What kind of impact did that have on you? What did that mean for you personally to see those protests?
Yeah, it was weird because I know intellectually that they were the biggest such demonstrations ever. But because they were the kind of first thing I reported on in Indonesia, it kind of framed the rest of my time there a little bit. It was less shocking to me than people who had spent a longer time there before they happened, because I do know that they were a very shocking development if you look at the big picture. But since everything was new when I moved there, and this was one of the first big political stories that I reported on there, it did seem to me like a lot of the developments in terms of intolerance and Islam in politics and religion in politics were less shocking to me, like in subsequent years, maybe than they would have been otherwise, just because my time frame there was totally bookended by this development. So like something like Jokowi picking Maruf Amin, who was the head of the Islamic Ulama Council, as his VP, was not shocking to me, because that it seemed to fit well within the parameters of what I had learned about Indonesian politics. But I understand that him picking that person is surprising if you look at the big picture, like after Reformasi.
I mean, speaking personally, I was deeply disappointed at Maruf Amin's selection. But after the fact, the 2020 hindsight, I see that it's now a stroke of genius, because it was actually more of a regional play. He managed to secure a bigger percentage of the vote in East Java. But much has been said. It's been sort of a truism that there has been a lurch towards conservatism. Where do you see that trend now? And I ask that because Habib Rizik, as you say, the head of the FPE, the FPI, the Islamic Defenders Front, is still in Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. The education minister is in the hands of the Gojek founder, Nadine Makarim. That used to be a religious affairs portfolio. Do you think the lid is on it for now? And with the military taking this, well, that's my personal view. I'm just curious of where you see religion and politics now.
Yeah, I mean, even leaving Arabisasi out of the question altogether, I think we will continue to see religion and politics and religious democracy in Indonesia and in a lot of other countries for the foreseeable future. I try pretty hard not to use the word secular as a
No,
concept or as
no.
even a frame when I talk about Asian politics, because I really think that secularism was a flash in the pan in a lot of countries like Indonesia and India and even Egypt, because there was a period after World War II when these post-colonial leaders had a very strong vision. But it was, to me, it was always an elite-led vision of secularism that was attractive to Western liberals and interpreters of history, but it almost never got the kind of grassroots support that is required in a democracy. And again, Turkey is another great example of this. So all these countries and the Bandung, basically the Bandung conference attendees had a kind of secular liberal vision, but it was often imposed through elite or authoritarian means. So that's why we do see in so many of these countries, Indonesia, India, Turkey, in the Arab world, religion seems to come back with a vengeance as these countries grow more democratic. But I think that's more the norm or the standard, and the exception is just Western Europe, which is really the only place in the world that has gotten more secular as it became more democratic over the course of the 20th century. And even, our own country, America, is incredibly religious, one of the most religious democracies in the world. And I think of it kind of as a Indonesia joke as the world's largest Christian majority country. It's an incredibly religious place. So I don't, yeah, and it's perfectly encapsulated in the fact that people use the acronym LGBT as a loan word almost.
As a loaded, also a loaded loan word.
Yeah, but
So
I mean, a huge number of people who like are like Tolak LGBT would not be able to need to figure out a way to do so without using the language of Western liberalism. There's got to be a way to advocate for rights, because what I think are unqualified negative things is something like the anti-LGBT discourse or blasphemy laws. I think anyone can agree that those are really awful things that happen in Indonesia now. But I think there is a task before people who are against those kind of things to figure out a way to articulate a position that can accommodate religion within that. I think a good example of this, not to be too abstract, is polygamy. I think a lot of women's rights activists are very against polygamy because it, on welfare grounds. And Indonesian Islamic scholars have found an ingenious way to combat this by saying that according to the verse that allows for polygamy in the Quran, they say you can have 4 wives if you treat all 4 wives the same. Obviously, in real life, it's impossible to treat 4 women the same way. So our interpretation of this is that you cannot marry more than 1 woman. So I think that's great. It's like a way forward to articulate kind of human rights positions in a way that it's kind of a big tent way to do that includes religious people. Because the vast majority, technically everyone in Indonesia is religious because you're not allowed to be atheist.
That's right.
But in reality, the vast majority of people are, in fact, religious. And I don't think it needs to be seen as I don't see it as a bad thing personally. And I think that there's a big task ahead for human rights and so on to figure out a way to work within that framework.
Right. Well, and the things that you're pointing at here are actually they're like LGBT rights. They tend to be more objected to as on sort of xenophobic grounds rather than anti-religious grounds. So like that's a foreign concept, and you're upsetting our culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we do have to sort of step back a bit and be a little less judgy when it comes to religious and our notions of secularism, because it's such a massive part of life here.
Tell you what those letters stand for.
No idea at all. Krithika, I've enjoyed our conversation very much. It's getting late there. Krithika Varagur, she is the author of the book, The Call, Inside the Global Saudi Religious Project. And you have an article coming out in Harper's, or at least you're working on something. Tell us about that.
I can't really talk about it right now, but I most recently, I can tell you what I just did right before this. I spent 6 weeks in Minneapolis reporting on the aftermath of the George Floyd protests and the future of the racial justice movement there, and policing there for the New York Review of Books. And all 3 articles are up now on their website.
Krithika Varagur, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Great conversation.
And that's the program. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Krithika for taking the time to talk to us. Our producer is Stephen Handoko, research by Imam Shofman, music by Soundstripe. And you can reach us through Instagram at onthelevel_podcast. If you like us, please rate us. It helps us reach other listeners who might be interested. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.